Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. We have done many programs here at the Commonwealth Club since the COVID crisis began. We're doing them live stream instead of having a live audience, as everyone else is. And we welcome you to visit our website, www.commonwealthclub.org, for any of those programs or our YouTube or Facebook channels. So first, I'd like to welcome Lisa Feldman Barrett, the author of 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, and great idea to add the half lesson. But my first question for you is a pretty simple one. You talk a lot about busting the myths of the way people thought about how the brain worked, and we're going to go into that in more detail. But if you just had to ballpark a figure, what percent do you think we understand about the brain? Do you think that we're 25% of the way there, 5% of the way there, or 0.1% of the way there, given how much progress has been made in the last 40, 50 years?
Well, what we understand, I think, depends on what we can observe. It really depends on our measurement tools. And so I think, given the measurement tools that we have, I would say we're probably maybe 25% of the way there. But I say this really hesitantly because my guess is that as measurement tools improve, we'll discover things that we didn't know were even questions before, and that will reduce that percentage. So just to give you an example, there are these cells in the brain called glial cells, which are not neurons. And at first it was thought all they really did was support neurons. Now people think of them a little bit like the dark matter of the brain because they do all kinds of really important things that we didn't know before, which really complexifies the story even more than we originally thought. It turns out they can even communicate with each other using neurotransmitters, although not in the same way as neurons. So, just when scientists think they're really approaching, an explanation of something, somebody else discovers something that, rips open a whole new set of questions. And so that's why I'm being, a little bit about my answer.
It's great. You're being scientific about it. Some scientists are, some scientists aren't, but it really is a project that we have, it used to be maybe a couple thousand people working on this, and now we have millions of people across the planet working on it. It's just a great enterprise. And so I just wanted to get kind of an idea about how you thought about that. Another thing that you've mentioned in your book is something as simple as, we look at the light spectrum. Our eyes are designed to pick up a certain part of that light spectrum. That's not all that's going on. And so when we're looking at the brain the way we look at it now, we could be looking at a very small spectrum of what the whole operation is. So exactly. Complexity, you call it a complex mechanism. Very, very good. So I think you say in your first lesson, or your first half lesson, I should say, that the brain did not evolve for thinking. It's a very nice, big, bold statement. Lots of people think that that's what it's for. And you make a lot of great comparisons to other animal brains and so on. That's not nearly as special as people have been pushing for a while. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? Some of the myths that you've brought down, and if we'll talk about them each individually, but you can talk about the ones that you think that really need to be shelved.
As you know, and I think a lot of our listeners know, viewers know, scientists approach a question through the lens of their own beliefs and assumptions. And so a lot of neuroscience really initially approached the brain through the perspective of a very Western theory of mind, what we believe, how we believe minds work. And we were looking to the brain to try to explain how our minds work, but using the lens of this very Western idea that, that we have rational parts of our brain, which are newly evolved, and we have emotional and instinctual parts of the brain, which are we inherited from other animals, and that the two are constantly at war with each other for control of our behavior. And this is how we judge how ethical someone is or how healthy someone is, really on the basis of like how well does rationality kind of keep down or control, our inner beast, that, emotional beast brain that we have. And
the reptile brain, right?
The reptile brain and the so-called limbic system, which is
Right.
limbic meaning border of the reptile brain for emotion. And I think what we know is that we certainly know that in Western societies we value rationality, but it turns out that most of what's called the neocortex, where rationality was assigned a home, isn't new, actually at all. And most animals who are vertebrates, who have a backbone and a head, and senses like ours, share a very, very common brain plan. And even though to the naked eye, when you look at the brain of a lizard and the brain of a rat and the brain of a human, they, to the naked eye, look very different. Actually, genetically, they're actually very, very similar. Of course, with some differences. And if you go all the way back to a time when, creatures on the earth didn't have brains, you might not think you have to go back very far if you were just to look at, how things
That's
are.
the last election. You're not talking about that.
Yeah, exactly. But if you go all the way back, what you can see is that brains evolved around the same time as bodies got larger and more complex, and where simple mechanisms weren't really enough to control the complex systems in a body as it's getting larger and larger and larger. And as animals, as their environment, or what we call their niche, the part of the environment they care about, as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, you can never really say what evolution, what something evolved for. But I think it's fair to say that the brain's most important job is to keep your body alive and well, because frankly, you can look at the evolutionary story and it's certainly consistent with that, but you can also just think, well, if your brain isn't controlling your body, you die. So I think,
right.
Yeah,
pretty simple.
It's pretty simple.
One thing you have in your book, which I found very interesting, and we have a very different, not you personally, but there's a very different attitude towards evolutionary theory from the 19th century, when Darwin pushed his version forward. And other people popularized it and didn't even make it what he was saying. But even so, you talk about the animal Amphioxy, I think, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's from 500 million years ago. And you say it had something, not really a brain, but something starting to resemble a brain. Yeah. And then you said then evolution, over time changes. But one of the things that's very interesting about the way you described it is, first of all, that the brain is kind of changes because of not defective, but the genes don't reproduce exactly the right way, because Amphioxy still exists, right? So it's very interesting that, if you say that it's an ancestor, or at least we have a common ancestor with these very small animals, and it doesn't have to be this one, but all kinds of other small animals. And they all still exist. Then what are we doing here? Where are we like an offshoot that's really not important to the whole process? Because you kind of say DNA replicates. I mean, their DNA kept replicating, and so it's interesting how important are we? Are we the oddballs, and the main stuff is going on at the one celled level? Because they're still all around and in much greater numbers than we are. So
exactly. So there's a lot embedded in what you just said that is worth really unpacking. But I think one point to make is that, and it's certainly not my point, I'm just echoing a point made by Henry Gee, who is a paleontologist. I think he's a paleontologist. But anyways, he has written about evolutionary biology, and actually he's an editor at Nature, and he's written several really excellent books, but one of my favorites is called The Accidental Species, and he's really referring to us, to humans. And he really makes the point that evolution didn't aim itself at us. We are not the pinnacle of anything. So the idea that evolution proceeds along a linear upward scale, which is referred to as a phylogenetic scale, where there are continual improvements that are occurring,
Right.
is really not the right way to think about how evolution works. We are not the pinnacle really of anything except perhaps in our own minds. We're certainly special, but we also, there are lots of animals on this earth who have very special characteristics that we don't have, and that we actually really admire, and we endow our superheroes with them.
Right.
And so I think it's important to understand that the way evolution works, the way natural selection works, is every cell in your body replaces itself. I can't remember if it's some are, I think, once every 7 years, once every 10 years, but as cells replace themselves, that is, they replicate, the genetic material has an opportunity to mutate.
Mm-hmm.
That is to change slightly. And those slight changes, that variation is really what natural selection acts on. And
Mm-hmm.
what is natural selection? It's aspects of the environment that allow an animal to survive and thrive or not. And so, for example, Amphioxus, the little Amphioxus that I talk about, Amphioxy plural, those animals have not changed very much in like 400 million years, scientists think, because their environments actually haven't changed very much. So selection pressures on them have not changed. And as a consequence, they themselves have not changed. It's not very much. It's not the case that if you were to peek under the hood into the molecular genetics of their genes, that you would see they're identical in every way to an Amphioxus if we were able to catch one from 400 million years ago. But rather, the variation in that population remains somewhat stable because the environment that the animal is living in remains somewhat stable. And that's the only reason why those animals, you can infer that those animals haven't really changed tremendously, although there is a little bit of debate about how much they've changed. And many, many, many creatures have died. Like for example, chimpanzees are our closest cousin in the animal kingdom, only because all the other species that were closer to us have perished. There's nothing special about a chimpanzee other than that it survived as a species. So there are, we don't know how many species have perished, but probably trillions of animals have died between when Amphioxus made its first appearance in the ocean and us. And so,
well, it's such a different viewpoint on evolution, because actually all these animals that we came from, that we assume we developed from over time, they all still exist. I mean, and sharks have been pretty similar for 300 million years, and cockroaches too, and so on. And so some seem to get into a niche and they can just keep staying the same, but offshoots of them adjust. And so it's a kind of an interesting thing. If we all have a common ancestor, which one? You mentioned too about this, we're the pinnacle of evolution. That seems to be because Darwin had his ideas right after Hegel had his ideas about where everything was headed. And it has a lot to do with Western civilization and what we all thought, Europeans thought was that they were the height because of the Industrial Revolution. So,
well, I mean, I think you could probably, you would know better than I, but I think you can probably trace it all the way back to Aristotle, who really was the first, the first phylogenetic scale. But I would say, biologists are a little cagey about whether or not animals that we see now are the same as their ancestral forms. So I think it's a little tricky to say that an animal remains the same as it was millions of years ago and hasn't changed at all. I mean, there are ways to assess this, and there are ways to estimate how much change has occurred. But when we look at a chimpanzee or a macaque or a rat or any animal, we're not looking at an ancient form. We're looking at a modern form that lives in an environment, a niche, which has selection pressures that keep the variability within certain constraints. And actually, if you just left things alone, what you would see is that that genetic change is the rule, variation is the norm. It's not the it's not the oddball. So beer makers know this, right? Beer makers know this because if you just leave the yeast alone, they mutate and mutate and mutate, and then you lose the taste of the beer. You actually have to find a way to stabilize the genetics of the population of yeast that you're using, or else the taste will change. And so what's remarkable is not that change happens. What's remarkable is when things stay the same. The fact that we have some genes that organize, it's kind of like the GPS for organizing cells in what's a head and what's a body and what's a tail. And the fact that we see some of those in invertebrates like flies, for example, that means that there's some very, 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 very strong selection pressure that all animals have been under that only allow those genes, animals with those genes, to have survived, and all the other ones who had mutations of those to have died. Yeah, variation is the norm. Yeah.
First, if I had known that you were going to talk a little bit about beer, we probably should have put it in the description. We would have had an even bigger audience. but if we talk about the evolution as this kind of much more elaborate idea, it puts a different perspective, and we'll get back to the brain in a second, but it puts a different perspective on the climate change that human beings are creating, because we're going to be putting pressure on all other animals to adjust to what we're doing, right?
Yes. So, if you think about it as a person, it might be horrifying, but if you think about it as a scientist, it's interesting that one of the things that humans can do that really other animals can do like much less, but humans do really in spades, is that we don't just adapt to the environment, we change the environment that we are adapting to. So other animals, add to the environment, like they might, termites might build a nest, or ants might build, a mound with like tunnels under the ground. Humans,
beavers make a dam.
Yeah. Beavers make a dam. Humans don't just add to the world, don't just modify the world as it is. We actually add new features to the world. We basically have the ability to create reality in things where they didn't exist before, like money, for example, where we all impose a function on a little piece of paper and poof, it has that function.
Right.
And as a consequence, we don't just adapt to the world, we shape the world. We shape the world in ways that affect our own evolution. So more so than other animals, we are able to actually shape the direction of our own evolution, even though we're completely unaware of doing it. And climate change is a really good example. And as a consequence, we're also shaping the evolution of other animals as well, for better or for worse.
You talk a lot about how our culture has an effect on the way we look at everything. And you mentioned how that affected people coming up with the idea of the triune brain, all those ideas were partially culturally based. And even as we talked about evolution, you can tell looking back now that the 19th century other ideas affected the way people thought about evolution and where it was going. So you talk about the brain as a network. Now, you say that's not a metaphor, and you explain how the other ones are metaphors. And so I think it's a very good thing to explain in detail why this is not a metaphor, but an actual physical reality that we're looking at.
Yeah, I would say it's like a concept, actually, rather than a metaphor per se. So when we say that that we have a triune brain, meaning a brain that evolved in three parts. So we have an inner lizard brain, for instincts, and we have a limbic system for emotion that lays on top. And then on top of that evolved a neocortex, a cerebral cortex for rationality. The idea there is that, the brain evolved like sedimentary rock, just adding layers on top. Yeah. Or I personally like the birthday cake analogy, so, your inner beast is like a birthday cake. And then, the cortex is like the icing on top of that already baked cake. And those are metaphors. We're saying this is like that. When we talk about, the brain, when we talk about brain wiring, we actually are using a metaphor, because neurons are not wired together literally. They're not soldered together literally. If you have one neuron here and one neuron here, there's actually a space between them called a synaptic cleft, and chemicals are ejected from one neuron and are picked up by the other. And that's actually how neurons communicate with each other, in part. And
very, very quickly, it's amazing how fast they can send the neurotransmitters and move it along. I mean, because it's a liquid form, actually.
Right.
So,
right. But when you talk about the brain being a network, that's really more like a concept for describing. It's not a metaphor. You're not, when I talk about the brain being a network, like the airport system being a network, that's a metaphor. You're saying, well, this is, and so you're some of what you describe about in the metaphor, you're able to use that description to reflect back onto the original thing that you're interested in. So when we talk about air travel in the world as a complex network of various elements, and we talk about how air travel works, we can use that to make hypotheses or ideas about how any network works, including a brain network. But, physically, that 3-pound blob of gray stuff between your ears is really approximately, give or take, about 128 billion neurons plus, 80 billion or so glial cells, give or take, all bathed in a chemical system, a chemical, bath of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. And that is your brain. I mean, there's also other stuff like, vascular, veins and arteries and things like that. But that's basically your brain. It's billions and billions and billions of little elements that are constantly communicating with each other and producing outputs that are more than the sum of their parts, meaning that when they work together, they produce outputs that none of them could produce on their own. And so it's a description, it's one description of what a brain is and how it works, which is not really a metaphor per se.
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that you explained, which I thought was very interesting, was that the fetal brain, or at least the baby brain, has more neurons in it than we do, and that they get, and you described the process as trimming and pruning, that whole process, and also that they then make these hubs and connections, and they each sort of focus on communicating with a few thousand other things, but they don't communicate to the whole. They communicate through hubs. I think you should describe that in a little bit more detail, because I think that's a fascinating way to look at what happened, and that we actually are getting rid of some neurons as we get older, as opposed to, and make it a more coordinated, more useful brain than it was when it was young.
Sure. So again, there's lots in there are lots of interesting tidbits in what you just described.
They're all from your book.
But they're kind of remarkable, right? Like, so yeah. The idea that, so the idea that that a fetal, that an embryo is producing neurons that will become the brain of that creature, whatever it is. And particularly if that creature is going to become a human, there many more neurons are being born than will actually survive. That it's exuberant. There's an exuberance in the number of neurons, and after a fetus is born, that infant brain, that newborn brain, has an exuberance of connections between neurons, many of which will die back. But they're there because really an infant brain is not a miniature adult brain. It's a brain that is waiting for wiring instructions from the world. And different infants are born into different worlds, literally, right? Different parts of the world, different social structures, their environments are different. And really one thing that a brain is doing as it's wiring itself to its world, both its physical world and its social world, is it's kind of bootstrapping into its wiring a model of that world. And so the exuberance of connections allows the baby's brain to tune itself to particular environments and to prune away unneeded or unused connections. So it's really a way of building flexibility into development, like tremendous flexibility, because a baby's brain is born under construction. And whether we realize it or not, we are creating, the caretakers of those infants are creating the world, curating the world that the infant's brain wires itself to. That's a pretty remarkable thing.
It's a pretty big responsibility too.
It's a huge responsibility, and it has huge benefits, but it also has huge risks for us as a species.
One analogy which you used in your first book that I thought was great was that you say how we look at the world, and that you can perceive it as a Vermeer where it's detailed like a photographic thing, or it can be an impressionistic perception, which is much vaguer, or you said on a bad day, a Jackson Pollock. But I thought that was very good at showing the disintegration of the information, coming in terms of how clear it is. Are we assuming from the neuroscientific point of view that there's an objective reality we're looking at, that we all kind of see it, or see it differently, and that's why we're wiring differently, we're reacting differently, and our brains end up differently? Or is it assumed that there is no objective reality that because we just hallucinate all the time anyway? We'll get into the hallucination a little bit later. I thought that was another great idea in your book.
Thanks. Yeah, so I can't speak for all neuroscientists, obviously, but to the best of my understanding, I would say that there's maybe a little bit of truth, if you can. Scientists don't like that word. We don't like the F word, fact, and we don't like the word, the T word, truth. Those are really scary words for scientists. But I guess what I would say is something. I think it's something kind of maybe close to what you've written, about the intersection or places where idealism and rationalism kind of overlap. And I guess what I would say is this: the brain wires itself to its physical surroundings. Your body is the physical. A brain's body is partly its physical surroundings, and then there's also wavelengths of light and changes in air pressure and changes in chemical concentration, and these things are real in the physical world to the extent that we understand the physical world, right? And so brains require input. Your retina has to be stimulated with light in order for the rest of your visual system in your brain to develop normally. And in fact, just as an example, there's some evidence to suggest that myopia is related to, that is, being short-sighted, is related to, night lights being used. And when an infant is young, and that changing how the brain is wiring itself to the visual world that it's exposed to. But there are many, many, many features, physical features in the world, and we as the caretakers of a young human, we will emphasize certain features, and we will background or even ignore other features of the world. So, a human infant has the capacity to hear all kinds of sounds, but eventually it loses the ability to hear some of those sounds because it doesn't hear them on a regular basis. And, the brain is kind of a use it or lose it sort of an organ. So the ability to hear those sounds are pruned away. They can be relearned with great effort. But the point that I'm getting to is that, really what the brain is doing is it's building an internal model of its body in the world, and it's using that model as a filter for all incoming sensory data, all sense data from the body and from the world forevermore. You never can pull back the curtains of your internal model and see the physical world for what it is. That's just not possible. And unless you have an illness, or unless we use some fancy techniques to make it possible, for a brief instance.
Right.
If you don't have prior experience with something, you have a hard time. You just experience it as noise, you're experientially blind. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you use an example, a cocktail party effect, and I wanted to talk about the fact that, in a way, our bodies. Since our experiences are in our minds, and our bodies are collecting all the sensory data, someone's doing the filtering, as you say, or something is doing the filtering, and you learn it. The brain does it. Whoever does it, whatever does it. It's a very fascinating part of our experience, this cocktail party effect, that you're in a party with lots of people in different discussions going on, and you're paying attention to your small conversation. But if someone uses your name halfway across the room, you immediately hear it. And so it must mean that all that noise is going into your head, and that your brain will always recognize your own name. And this shows how narcissistic we are, I think. But another example like that I find fascinating is, let's say you're driving along, and you're on the highway, and you're listening to the radio, and your favorite song is on, and you're singing along to it. And you see a car driver up ahead misbehaving, like cut in front of a whole bunch of people back and forth. And you watch out because you wonder, is he going to cause an accident? I have to be prepared. And then you suddenly realize, no problem. And so 10 seconds have gone by. And during those 10 seconds, you didn't hear the song at all. You don't hear that. All your attention is focused on the problem that you have to deal with. And you know that all that sound has been going into your head, but you don't hear it at all. I find that fascinating.
Yes, but that's happening. That particular dynamic is happening all the time. So, for example, right now, you are sitting on a chair, I'm imagining, right? And so I'm about to draw your attention to the fact that the seat of the chair is pressing up against your legs. Mm-hmm. And if your feet are on the floor, then the floor is pressing up against the bottoms of your feet. But you probably that probably wasn't in the focus of your attention a moment ago until I just mentioned it. And now it is.
Now it is, yeah.
And so we have the ability to foreground certain features of the world and background other features by virtue of this spotlight of attention that we have, which basically allows us to choose to some extent what is signal and what is noise in the world. But I will say that there are some features of the world that will not be meaningful to you no matter how much attention you give to them. So if you don't speak Chinese, if you don't speak Mandarin, mm-hmm. you can attend to someone speaking Mandarin, but those sounds, you might be able to recognize it as a language, but you wouldn't be able to understand what those sounds mean. Or, like the old, this was also in my first book, the old adage, like, when a tree falls in the forest, and no one else is around, does it make a sound? Well, the answer is actually no, it doesn't make a sound. It gives off, there are changes in air pressure. Right. But something has to transduce that into an audible sound. And in order to understand that it's a tree falling and hear it as a tree falling, you have to be able to make sense of it. You have to have had past experience that allows your brain to make sense of those sensory changes as a tree falling. So when you hear, this is sort of how your brain works all the time. Basically, your brain is trapped in a dark, silent box called your skull, and it's receiving sense data from the world. It's anticipating and receiving those sense data. And the sense data are the effects. They're the outcomes of some set of causes. So you hear a loud bang, and what is it? Is it someone slamming a door? Is it somebody, crashing a car? Is it somebody dropping a big box on the ground? Is it a gunshot? If you live in the United States, what is that big sound? So your brain has to guess. It has to guess at the causes of these effects. And philosophers call this a reverse inference problem, or an inverse inference problem, where you have access to the outcomes, to the effects, but you don't know the cause. And so you have to guess. And your brain is using its past experience, this internal model of the world that it's built, to make those guesses.
It's interesting that a part of one of your lessons, of course, is about how the world remakes the brain and how other people remake the brain. And to go back to the tree that's falling, we don't hear it. But if we do leave some of our new technology out there, and it picks up that pressure, the pressure that was created in the air by it, and then it gets transmitted millions of miles to us or whatever, like we do in space, then we still can hear something and still make a judgment about it. Just like now, instead of being in a room talking to each other, this is all being transferred to each other digitally, and yet we can still make sense of it. So
but
it's
if
like
you can record it.
Yeah. And we take our senses and extend them way out into into reality with all of our technology, and it's just another way of collecting things to try to decide what's going on.
Exactly. And in fact, you can think about every scientific tool that has ever been built as an extension of human senses in one way or another, that we can see smaller, farther, differently, broader. We can hear, we're basically expanding our ability to sense the world using technology that augments our limited, human senses. And but we still have to do that. We still have to solve that reverse inference problem. And that's really what scientific, that's really what the scientific method is supposed to help us with.
Right. The interesting thing about that, going back to the five senses, you go into this, but our eyesight is tuned in to pick up the light waves in a certain range. Our hearing is designed to pick up those percussions in the air. Our smell and our taste buds are there to pick up different chemicals, right, or different proteins. We could be tasting, smelling, attending to all kinds of other details now that we don't not need to rely on our senses with technology, and then make it a better reconstruction of what reality is. I mean, there's all kinds of light waves we know about, the ultraviolet, infrared, but much more than that. And we have much better, especially in astronomy, much better idea about what's going on, looking at other things other than the light waves. So it's interesting how science has not just extended our senses, but given us new senses, like being able to look at rocks in the sedimentary levels, or like the slivers of ice I just read about, the slivers of ice that tell them in 536 in the spring, there was a volcanic eruption, because they can go down in the ice, and that volcanic eruption was the cause of the historically low temperatures.
I agree with you, but I would say really what we're doing by extending our senses, giving us new senses, is we're doing sensory substitution. We can't actually see things outside the visible spectrum. What we can do is detect things outside that spectrum and translate it into a visible spectrum so we can see it.
Right. We can understand it. I mean, we're taking in senses through our senses, information about it. That information we can now take in different ways. That's what I meant. I don't mean that we can see it or hear it.
Yeah, you bet. And I think it's important to be, as a scientist, I always think it's important to be
precise.
Be precise, but also to be humble and be a little bit, have what contemplative philosophers call a beginner's mind, which is be open and be humble, and try to, I guess the best way to say it is this. We know it's not that we discovered that electrons exist in the real world, in the physical world. What we know is that given our ability to measure things the way that we can, something that is described well as an electron exists in the physical world. But that's about the best we can do, right? And that's pretty awesome. Right. But it's all limited by what we can detect or sense, and what our brains can make sense of. We are fundamentally a bunch of brains trying to figure out how stuff works, right? Including our own brains.
And you focused on being a brain, trying to figure out what the brain is doing.
Yeah, exactly. We're a bunch of brains trying to figure out how brains work.
So there's so many other things. What other modern myths that you have talked about that you think you would like people to sort of dispel? I love the humble approach. I mean, that really is basically the scientific method or approach or attitude. I believe this until someone gives me a better explanation. Basically, it doesn't fit well with how we usually think about the world, though. I mean, most people are so used to being authoritarian about everything. That it's very hard to get onto it. And I think that actually goes along with democratic ideas, but we're not used to that either. So, so we're retraining our brains to be both democratic and humble. And it's a lot of rewiring that has to take place.
Yeah. And, it's a lot of rewiring, and it's expensive because metabolically it's expensive because, there's a certain amount of uncertainty that comes with being humble and being curious and being open, and uncertainty is metabolically expensive. And that's interesting, but it's also profound in the sense that, understanding our brains in terms of their most important job, meaning, sure, your brain does you have thoughts and you have feelings and you see things and you hear things and you taste things, but all of that is happening in the service of regulating your body, whether you know it or not, whether you believe it or not, it's kind of irrelevant. That's really, to some extent what's happening. And understanding that actually helps dissolve boundaries that are really illusory, like between mental and physical health, for example. It helps us understand why, depression and heart disease go hand in hand. There's like a 70% comorbidity rate, or why right now, when people are really metabolically encumbered for many different reasons, we have record rates of depression and opioid dependence and metabolic illnesses. And these are, understanding how the brain works doesn't answer all the questions. It's not a reductionistic approach, but it just brings to light maybe a couple of elements that you were unaware of. And that gives you a little bit more understanding of how you can tinker with your own life to, improve things a little bit for yourself.
You talk about that brain being the command center to keep your body, and you talk about the body budget and keeping it in balance. And we'll let the people read in detail about that in the book. But you also talk about how there isn't like a particular purpose to evolution and a particular drive, that we're doing this ourselves. And so one of the ideas that doesn't disappear is that DNA wants to reproduce, or that your DNA has to reproduce, or that's sort of a function of what's going on. And doesn't that entail a little bit of a why and a purpose in it? If, like, who gives DNA the desire, or, where does that desire come from? People, as you say in your book, some people have said God, some people have said nature. So but in the end, something has to have that desire, whether it's the DNA or us or maybe no one has a desire and it's just automatic.
I think it's really, really tricky to talk about these things because English, and maybe this is true of other languages too, I don't know, but English is it's hard to not endow things with agency, because English is almost like in the way that we speak, so does DNA have a desire to reproduce? I don't think that's a defensible scientific claim.
Right.
Certainly humans and I think you could say other animals have desires, or they certainly have consciousness in the sense that they experience the world. They may not be aware that they're experiencing the world, but they see and they hear and they and so on. And so and they probably feel pleasure, displeasure. I mean, at least vertebrates probably do. I think it's still a question, and it might be a philosophical question as opposed to a scientific one. I'm not really sure. I mean, but I think I could defend that, that they feel pleasure and pain. But I think we have to be careful. Evolution, it doesn't have a motive. Neither does DNA. That's oftentimes why biologists really talk about selection at the organism level, not at the DNA level, right?
Yeah.
That really selection pressures, like how hot it is or how much food there is, or, those kinds of things aren't selecting at the level of DNA. They're selecting at the level of the organism, which is a complex mishmash of, lots of different DNA. And frankly, not all of that DNA is our genes. Some of it is turning genes on and off in response to environmental circumstances. In fact, most of it is doing that. So I agree with you in the sense that that at least when we're talking about much of the animal kingdom, at least vertebrates, it might be possible to talk about motivation or desire to some extent. But I think that we have to be really careful about imbuing agency to things where there really is no agency. And I
agree completely. That's why I asked the question. Because in the popular press about DNA, it sounds like DNA was the next in line after God and nature to be the one that needs something from life, whereas evolution is at the level of the organism, and we don't know what agency, what decisions make the change, or if it's how much of its environment and so on. But I think it's another myth that's I wanted to help dispel, was this whole idea that we're doing everything for DNA, because there's a lot of social repercussions of that idea. People who don't reproduce then are considered there's something wrong with their DNA. And I wanted to kind of undercut that idea a little bit. Thank you.
Agreed. Completely. Yeah.
So we have lots of questions, and let's get to questions from the audience now. First question that came in. I was wondering if Dr. Feldman Barrett had any opinion on anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff and physicist Sir Roger Penrose's theory of consciousness residing in microtubules.
No, I have no opinion.
No opinion. I thought, we're not talking about consciousness today, right? Okay. Second one, can you expand on selection pressure? What does that entail? Can you give me some examples of selection pressure?
Sure. So I think a really good example comes from this book, which is a really wonderful book called The Beak of the Finch. It won a Pulitzer Prize, and the name of the author is escaping me. But it's a great book, I will say. I've read it a number of times. And in the book, he talks about Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Island. They're actually named for Darwin, but they're little birds. You can see them sometimes in pet stores when we all used to be allowed to go into pet stores. And, their beak shapes differ randomly by mutation. So some in the same species, some birds will have a very deep beak, and some will have a shallow beak. Some will have a pointy beak and that's long, and others will have kind of a thicker, shorter beak. And it turns out that the shape of the beak influences how well an animal can crack open a seed or a nut. So the weather conditions, whether it's really dry or really wet, determines how which animals with which beaks can crack open the nuts more easily. The more food that an animal gets, the better able that animal will be to survive and have the metabolic resources to reproduce, which is a very expensive, metabolically expensive thing to do for any animal. So that's an example. The weather conditions change the consistency of the shell of the seeds and nuts, and different animals who, different beak shapes will make it easier or harder to crack open the nuts in that season And that means that the animals have differential access to food and nutrients. That's a selection pressure that influences the reproduction of those animals, how many offspring make it to the next generation and survive to reproduce. Now, I chose that example for a reason. And the reason is that food, nutrition, is a key selection pressure. It's a key selection pressure on all kinds of things, including reproduction. So if you live in a part of the world where, or even a part of the country where you have plentiful access to food, whereas somebody else lives in a food desert, that is, you could say, a selection pressure. In fact, money, which we use to purchase food, many of us, I mean, some of us grow our own food, but not as much as we used to, is also now a selection pressure that you could describe similarly to, these other selection pressures, which change the consistency of shells and nuts. It's very, very similar. So the anything which in the long run, not in the immediate moment, but in the long run, changes the odds that an animal can produce offspring and that those offspring will survive to the next generation to reproduce. Anything which changes those odds is a selection pressure.
And you keep going back to expensive decisions from the point of view of making your body survive, and so I find that a very interesting way to look at it, and it's a different way of looking at, say, something like inertia in our social situations, that people people who want to change things are always complaining that everybody else has inertia, but actually what you might say instead is that they're not ready to change until it's perfectly obvious that is going to be worth the effort to do the change. In a way, it reminds me of the Chinese communist situation, because the bureaucracy there, when Deng Xiaoping made several changes, he would try an experiment, and then it would be pulled back, and all those people would be punished. And then they tried to make the experiment again, it would pull back, all those people would be punished. And the third time, which was the time they really switched over, they couldn't get anybody over the age of 35 to make that decision, or not anybody, but almost nobody would make that decision again. So they ended up with a very large number of young executives for their big companies in their 30s and 20s, almost like Silicon Valley, because everybody else was saying, no, I won't change. Otherwise, I'm just going to go back to a re-education camp. And that might prove to be in history why they grew so much in the 90s and in the early 2000s, because they had all these young executives making their decisions because the other people wouldn't. Anyway, there's all kinds of pressures like that, inertia, which might prove to not be just stupidity, laziness, and all that, but an attempt to that this isn't worth it. This change isn't worth it economically to us, to our bodies.
Yeah, I think that that's really, I haven't ever heard that analysis before. It's that's a really, really interesting analysis, which I'm going to have to think more about that. I mean, about what you were talking about China. But yeah, I mean, I guess the thing to point out is that most of the time we aren't really aware of our brain doesn't make itself aware, of this constant budgeting that it's doing. The most expensive thing that your brain can do is move your body or learn something new. Metabolically speaking. And, for example, cortisol is not a stress hormone. It's a hormone that gets glucose into your bloodstream quickly when your brain is predicting that you're going to need it. So, for example, right before you get up in the morning, you have assertive cortisol because your brain is going to drag your sorry self out of bed, in a few moments, and that's going to cost something metabolically speaking. And many things make it possible for you to invest, to spend in the hopes of getting now we are talking about a metaphor. So body budgeting really isn't, it is a metaphor. That's not, your brain isn't really running. It doesn't really have a budget. There's no abacus or calculator in there. But, I think it's important that, a lot of things, again, that we sort of attribute to agency in someone may actually also have other explanations that don't replace, nothing. There are no simple single causes when it comes to human action or human behavior. It's really more like a bunch of nudges and small, weak interacting influences. And so, but for example, if you're running a deficit in your body budget, let's say you haven't slept enough, you aren't eating healthfully, you don't exercise very much, maybe you're financially actually encumbered for, in terms of economics, in terms of money, all of these things. And maybe you're on social media, too much. And there's a lot of social ambiguity there, which is very expensive. Maybe you're on your computer too late at night, which, makes it harder for your brain to go to sleep, which, has a cost. And each of these costs that you pay, they're not like huge costs. They're like little taxes that add up over time to a big deficit. What do you do when you're running a deficit in your actual bank account?
Ask the federal government.
Well, I would stop spending. I would slow spending. Yeah. And what does that mean to a brain in our metaphor? It means that you will stop moving. You'll feel fatigued and tired, and you'll stop moving, and you'll stop learning, and you'll just kind of go with what you believe, and you won't keep updating that internal model. So you'll just go with what you believe. You'll succumb to, and maybe even cultivate a silo for yourself, because when you're in a silo of information, everything is perfectly predictable, and that's cheaper. It's just metabolically cheaper, so it feels better. And
you're supporting the theory that most great science is done by 26-year-olds.
No, I'm not actually.
In that sense, because before they get tired. Yeah.
I would say when I was 26, I was chronically sleep deprived because, like most 26-year-olds, I thought that
in grad school.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, I'm actually saying that, that part of that creativity and innovation are expensive. Mm-hmm. And if we want that from people, then we have to really create the selection pressures. We have to create the environment for them to do it, to be able to do that well. And that means paying attention to some of these physical things, or things that, even social things that have a physical cost, that we largely ignore as a culture.
It's another angle on issues of, if we eliminate the ability of one half of the population to be creative and do what's on their mind, like if you don't allow women to be educated or anything else like that, then you have created a cost for the entire society that it cannot make up, and that any society that allows that is bound to be more creative and ahead of other societies that don't. And in the long term, the competition will be hard to beat. The same thing with just letting people have one bad thing that happens to them, like break their leg. And then if you just left them alone, they would die in nature. But if we take care of them, then we've saved all of the creativity of that person for their whole life, basically. And there's lots of issues like that as to what society will do and not do in order to do that. But it also reminds me that right now, everybody's kind of shut down for COVID-19. And it will take some time, as predicted, for everybody to get back to their old habits because they're used to not having to do as much.
Yeah, I would say, though, that a lot of people are pretty encumbered at the moment. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been surfing my own tsunami of stress. And what is stress? Stress is when your brain is preparing your body for a big metabolic outlay, and that outlay either never comes or you don't replenish. You don't make deposits into your body budget after you've had a big spend. And I think, if I were to architect a set of conditions that would easily bankrupt a human body budget, it would be this one, and then just add COVID on top of that. So I think that people, and of course, people are resilient and some people are more resilient than others and so on. But I do think that we kind of have to give ourselves a break, actually, and give each other a break a little bit, because, we might be talking about body budgeting as metaphorical, but the fact that the idea that your brain is using glucose and water and salt and so on, and so is the rest of your body, and the idea that metabolic efficiency is a major selection pressure. That is not metaphorical. That is actually true to the extent that anything is true. And that is at play right now, even just as you and I are talking. It's always present. It's not always the dominant causal force, but it's always present. And that's something for people to think about, I think, because there are some lessons there for people if they choose to consider the science.
So we have a couple more questions here before we wrap it up. One, it goes to one of your lessons about how we interact with each other. Do you think there is such a thing as a family brain with which family members are able to emotionally regulate one another, both across generations and in acute moments?
I would say, I wouldn't describe it as a family brain, but I would say that humans are social animals and we regulate each other's body budgets. Again, figuratively speaking, we make deposits and withdrawals. Right. And there is really, really good evidence that humans do better when they are in supportive relationships with other humans. And when I say do better, I don't just mean we're more creative and we're, happier. I mean, we live longer, we are less likely to develop illness, we are more likely to recover from that illness, and even our susceptibility to developing illness upon exposure to a virus, right? So a virus is a necessary but not sufficient condition for illness. You can't become sick without a virus. Well, you can actually, but that's a whole other conversation. But being exposed to a virus alone is not on its own sufficient for developing illness. In controlled studies, something like only 20 to 40% of people develop respiratory symptoms upon being exposed to a virus. Right. These are old viral challenge studies, but they were really, really well done. So the answer here, I think, is that we do regulate each other's nervous systems. All animals who are social animals do this to some extent. We do this, though, humans do this in remarkable ways, including with the raise of an eyebrow or just a couple of words, right? I can text a couple of words to a friend of mine who's halfway around the world, and I can change her metabolism, her breathing rate, her heart rate. You can read something in the Quran or in the Bible or poetry or philosophy that was written thousands of years ago, and you can take comfort from that. And comfort is your feeling of comfort is actually indicative of the fact that something has happened metabolically in your body and in your brain as you're reading those words. So, is there a family brain? Maybe there's I would say maybe a collection of brains that are, that are working in concert with one another for sure. Absolutely.
This is not one of the questions from the audience, but from me. And I want to make sure I brought this point up that you mentioned because I thought it was interesting. Very interesting. You said that there's studies that show that even eating healthy food, if you're under stress, your body will still process it in a way which isn't healthy. There are these moments, right, where, as a scientist, I'm like, that is amazing. And as a person, I'm like, oh, my God.
So these are really, really interesting studies by a scientist named Janice Kikolt-Glaser, who's at Ohio State University. And she's shown that when you are stressed, so remember, what is stress? Stress is when your brain is preparing your body for a major metabolic outlay. That's it. That's what stress is. Okay. And chronic stress is where that keeps happening and you're not, replenishing what you've spent. And good stress, like exercising, is where you make that metabolic outlay, but it's like an investment for the future. And then you immediately replenish. You drink, you eat, you sleep, whatever. So what Janice Kikoc-Glaser has shown is that if you're stressed within a day of eating, like within a couple of hours or a day of eating something, you're basically your body is metabolizing, the efficiency with which it metabolizes food is reduced. And so essentially that adds a little tax. And that tax is the equivalent of about 104 calories to your meal. And so if you add that up over a year, that's of meals, that's like 11 pounds that you could gain just by eating super healthy food, but when you're stressed. That's really, really cool from a scientific standpoint, and utterly horrifying, as a person, I would say anyways.
Science never promises that the answers that it comes up with are going to make us feel good about what we're doing.
I know, right?
Now, this you've answered before, but I think it's a good point to bring up again, just so that you can nail it one more time. Are emotions controlling most people's thinking from that portion of our brain being dominant, or is that mostly a familial cultural fact? So you've already said it's not in a part of your brain, so.
Yeah, there's no part of your brain for emotion and no other part of your brain for rationality. That's just wrong. I mean, there's just so much evidence to suggest otherwise. But there's a grain of something very, very important, a little gem in this question that I think is really important, and that's the following. Your brain is always running a budget for your body. It's always controlling the systems of your body, always. From the moment you draw your first breath until the moment you draw your last. And your body is always sending sense data back to your brain. That's how your brain that's how your brain can learn something new about your body, like if there's tissue damage or something's happening. And it's how your brain controls essentially your body. There has to be that continual conversation. You are not wired. Most of us are not wired with neurotypical brains. We are not wired to experience those sense data coming from our bodies, from our hearts pumping and our lungs expanding and our liver producing bile and so on. We don't experience the sensations with the same degree of precision or vividness as we see or we hear. So, and even think about it, like when you have appendicitis, what do you feel? You feel kind of a dull ache in your abdomen. You don't know where, you don't know what's wrong. There's just kind of dull, achy feeling until right before, the moments before your appendix is about to burst. And that's when you feel the very specific pain in a very specific spot. So how does a brain kind of keep a handle on what's going on in the body? And the answer is evolution has fashioned us with simple feelings, feeling pleasant, feeling unpleasant, feeling kind of worked up or feeling calm, feeling comfortable, feeling uncomfortable. So we don't experience all the sensations in their high dimensional detail from the body. Instead, we have this kind of like general barometer where we feel good or not so good, kind of crappy or okay. And these feelings people call mood, or scientists like me will call them affect with an A, affect. These affective feelings are always with you. Sometimes they're in the foreground, sometimes they're in the background, but they're really always there because your brain's always controlling your body and your body's always sending data back to your brain. And so you are never in a moment without feeling. These feelings are not emotions. These feelings they're simpler feelings that your brain uses when it's creating emotions. Sometimes these feelings become emotions, like your brain will use them as ingredients in a sense to make emotions. But sometimes these feelings you experience them as perceptions of the world, like that's a delicious drink, that's a really nice guy, that's a beautiful painting. So the idea that you would ever have a thought that is free from feeling is a myth. Your brain wiring doesn't allow that unless you don't, maybe, we're talking about neurotypical brains here. Your brain wiring ensures that you will always have some feeling. These feelings are like properties of consciousness to some extent. They could be in the background, they could be in the foreground, but they're always there. And what I would say is that traditionally we think about causation as thoughts causing feelings. But there's very good reason to suspect that the sense data from your body, which you experience as feelings, are actually setting the stage for causing the next round of thoughts that happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not exact. It's a little bit the other way around.
There's a lot of intuition versus intellect discussion in philosophy as well as to what's more basic. We have time for one last question, which will be a great way to finish this off. And it is, how is the way we are evolving as a species affected by our evolving understanding of the brain? So how is your work going to affect our evolution?
Well, that's a fantastic question. First time anybody's asked me that question. So I have great gratitude to the person who asked that question. The whole reason for writing this book, actually, there is not one reason, but one of the reasons was I wanted to give people a little bit of knowledge about the brain, so to sort of entertain people, obviously, and to to make them have dazzling conversations at dinner parties and so on. But also because I think that there are some. I really think about philosophy and science as, tools for living a life well. Mm-hmm. And there are some things about the brain that really do have serious implications for how we treat each other, how we raise our children, for policy decisions about, say, poverty, childhood poverty. In the book, I try really hard not to tell people what to think. Occasionally, I do sort of take off my lab coat and say, okay, I'm gonna let my opinion become clear here. But mostly, what I'm trying to do is just to get people to think, to invite them to think. Mm-hmm. And if, for example, the risk of there's great benefit in having a brain that is born under construction, but there are also great risks. And those risks are preventable in many cases. And so that's something that we should be thinking about as a society for all the reasons, George, that you mentioned about, thinking about capital, sort of human capital and innovation and creativity and so on. And so there are some things that we think about in political terms, like whether children should be separated from their caregivers at the border. Mm-hmm. And you can debate that politically all you want, but the biology is pretty clear, I think, on this point about whether or not harm will be done to those children and who exactly is responsible for that harm. So the
damage is clear.
The damage is clear. And so, yes, I do. I would not be so lofty as to say that I hope that we can change our own evolution by understanding more about the brain. I wouldn't have put it that way to myself when I was writing this, but I guess, yes, in the end, I am hoping that in some ways that will happen, at least on certain points where I think the evidence is really clear. We live, for example, here's another example. We live in a culture of casual brutality. Mm-hmm. And when anyone mentions this, they get called a snowflake or weak or whatever. But, the words that we speak to each other impact our body budgets and impact our nervous systems, not because we're snowflakes, not because we're weak, but because we're human. Mm-hmm. And you might think of this as a political issue, but it's a public health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
It's a public health issue, actually. And it doesn't really matter what your political beliefs are. It doesn't really matter whether you believe it's happening at all, because beliefs don't matter to what's actually happening under the hood in this regard. And so you should be aware of that. And whether that has any effect, I don't know, but hopefully it will.
Yeah. And from the point of view of the way you've described it in your book and everything, it's a little bit like saying that even though it's metabolically expensive to us, we should develop a better civilization.
Well, we exercise.
Yeah.
We exercise, we make big metabolic investments as investments because we expect them to pay off in the future. That's what exercise is. And if we're smart, we prepare ourselves. You have a protein drink before you exercise, and then you have water afterwards, and you make sure you get a good night's sleep. Democracy requires that we learn from each other and talk to each other and expose ourselves to ideas that we don't like and that we might even find super offensive. And like exercise, you could say that is a very good investment, but you have to prepare yourself for that investment.
So I hope everybody who's been listening today had a protein drink before and takes a drink of water afterwards. Thank you very, very much, Lisa. That was really a great discussion. And so ends another event of the Commonwealth Club in its 118th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you for joining us.